You know that feeling, right? That moment an emotion just hits you, not gently, I mean like a real punch.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it's that white-hot anger after, I don't know, a really frustrating meeting,
Yeah,
or just crushing sadness when something doesn't work out, or that wave of anxiety before a big presentation.
absolutely. Those intense feelings, they're part of being human. We all have them.
We do. But the real question is what happens next? How do you actually, navigate that internal storm when it feels like you're about to go under?
That's exactly it, isn't it? It's one thing to feel something strongly, but it's a whole different ballgame to actively do something about it, to try and influence how strong it is or how long it hangs around or even how you show it on the outside.
And that whole process, that active engagement with your feelings,
That's what psychologists call emotion regulation.
right. And that's what this deep dive is all about. Not some like abstract theory, but how we actually regulate our emotions out there in the messy real world.
In daily life.
Yeah, when you're really in the thick of it, dealing with the sudden problem or just, the everyday stuff that gets under your skin.
And we've got a great guide for this. We're looking at a really interesting recent study that took a different approach.
Right.
Instead of a lab, where they might tell people, okay, now feel sad, or try to think about this differently.
Right, which is kind of artificial.
It can be. This study used a daily diary method. So for a whole week, people reported on their actual experiences with strong negative emotions as they happened.
Ah, so it gives us a peek into the spontaneous choices people make moment to moment.
Exactly. Real-world choices.
So our mission here is to take this real-world data and really try to understand what it's telling us. Like, why do we instinctively reach for certain coping strategies when our feelings are dialed up to 11? Are there specific things, like maybe just how intense the emotion feels, or even maybe who you are, that kind of nudge you towards one way of dealing with it over another?
We're basically asking, when you feel really awful, what tools do you actually grab from your emotional toolkit and why those specific tools?
Okay, so get ready, you listening, to maybe see your own reactions in a new light. Because these findings, well, they reveal some pretty fundamental things about handling intense feelings.
Yeah, we'll start by really defining what emotion regulation means, according to this research. Then we'll break down the 5 main strategies they looked at.
Okay, 5 strategies.
Then we'll get into how they did the study, the daily diary part, and then the juicy stuff, the key findings about intensity, strategy choices, and even some pretty surprising differences based on gender.
Interesting. Let's start with the basics then. Emotion regulation, how does the source define it?
Well, they give a pretty comprehensive definition. They say it's the processes by which individuals influence which emotions they have, when they have them, and how they experience and express them.
Okay, influence which emotions they have. So that could be like deciding not to go to a party because seeing a certain person will make you anxious.
Exactly. That's influencing which emotion you even allow to start. Or it could be influencing how you experience it, like taking deep breaths when you feel anger rising.
Or how you express it, like trying not to yell even when you feel like it.
Precisely. It's an active management process.
Mm-hmm.
And the study really stresses how vital this skill is. It's not just, nice to be calm sometimes.
Right.
Being good at regulating your emotions is strongly linked to, well, better physical health, better mental health, doing better at work, having happier relationships, basically overall well-being.
And the flip side, difficulty with it.
Yeah, difficulty with emotion regulation is a known factor in things like depression and anxiety disorders. It really matters.
So managing your emotional responses isn't just some fuzzy concept. It's deeply tied to how well you function in life.
Absolutely. And the research also points out that regulation can happen at different points of the process.
That's so.
You can regulate before the emotion really gets going. Those are sort of anticipatory strategies. Or you can regulate after you've already started feeling it. Those are more response-focused strategies.
Okay, like bracing yourself before bad news versus trying to calm down after you get it.
Exactly that distinction. You can try to head it off or manage it once it's arrived.
Makes sense. So this study focused on 5 specific strategies people use. What were they?
Right, 5 key ones that pop up a lot in research. The first is reappraisal. You might also hear it called cognitive change.
Reappraisal sounds like thinking about something differently, changing your perspective.
That's it, exactly. The source defines it as changing how you think about a situation. Maybe trying to see it from another person's point of view, or just assigning a different meaning to what happened.
Okay, so classic example. You get stuck in traffic and you're going to be late. Instead of fuming, "This is ruining my day," You might reappraise it as, well, at least I get more time to listen to this deep dive, or it's annoying, but not the end of the world.
Exactly. You're actively reframing it. It's a cognitive strategy, requires thinking. And it's often seen as something you might do before you get totally overwhelmed or when you know you can't avoid the situation.
Yeah.
The study calls it a more complex mental technique. Needs effort.
Got it. Active mental effort to change the meaning. What's strategy number 2?
Number 2 is rumination. And this one, well, it's probably familiar to most people and often not in a good way.
Uh-oh. Sounds like getting stuck.
That's exactly what it is. The study defines it as concentrating on negative situations, getting caught up in the bad feelings and thoughts they trigger, or just endlessly analyzing the causes and consequences, going round and round without getting anywhere.
Yeah, that mental hamster wheel. Replaying arguments, worrying about what might happen, focusing on everything that went wrong. Why did I say that? What if this happens? That kind of loop.
That's rumination. And the research is pretty clear. It tends to keep negative emotions going, or even make them stronger and last longer. It's strongly linked to depression risk. It's basically about keeping your attention glued to the negative stuff.
Okay, so reappraisal is actively shifting your thoughts. Rumination is getting stuck in the negative thoughts. What about distraction?
Distraction also involves shifting your attention, like rumination does, but in the opposite direction.
Away from the negative.
Exactly. Instead of focusing on the bad feelings, you focus away from them. The study defines it as shifting your attention to different, maybe less upsetting parts of the situation, or deliberately looking away from what's causing distress, or even changing your internal focus, like thinking about happy memories or planning something fun.
So if you're feeling really anxious waiting for exam results, instead of imagining failing over and over, rumination, you might put on music, call a friend to chat about something totally different, or maybe do a puzzle.
Yes, diverting your focus to something positive or neutral, or just engaging in a different activity entirely. And the source mentions that distraction tends to work better when it's a conscious, deliberate effort to shift your focus, not just kind of zoning out passively.
That makes sense. Actively choosing to engage elsewhere versus just letting your mind drift.
Precisely. Okay, fourth strategy, acceptance. This one's become quite prominent in newer therapies.
Like mindfulness-based approaches, ACT, DBT.
Exactly those. Acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. The study defines acceptance here as acknowledging the situation, yourself, and your feelings just as they are, without immediately judging them or trying to fight them or push them away.
So just letting the feeling be there without trying to change it. That sounds simple, but maybe really difficult with strong negative feelings.
It definitely can be challenging.
Hmm.
But the research suggests acceptance is linked to actually lowering negative feelings and even the body's stress response over time. It's about noticing the feeling, saying to yourself, okay, I feel really anxious right now,
Right.
without layering on judgment like I shouldn't feel anxious, or immediately trying to force the anxiety away.
So it's not ignoring it, but observing it without struggling against it.
Right, observing without judgment or immediate action to eliminate it. And the final one they looked at is suppression.
Okay, suppression, like pushing feelings down.
Kind of. It's called a response modulation strategy, meaning it kicks in after the emotion is already underway. The study describes it as actively inhibiting the outward behavior linked to the emotion.
Like putting on a brave face, trying not to show you're upset.
Yes, that's part of it. Suppressing facial expressions, body language, maybe what you say. It can also mean trying to suppress the internal feeling itself, or the thoughts connected to it, like trying really hard not to feel angry, or pushing angry thoughts away.
Okay, I can see how people do that, trying not to cry at work or keeping a calm voice during an argument.
Exactly. But the study points out an important distinction based on other research. Trying to suppress the outward signs, the expression might sometimes make the feeling seem less intense, especially to others. But trying to suppress the internal feeling or the thoughts, that can actually backfire and make the internal experience even stronger.
Oh, interesting. So trying to bottle it up inside might just crank up the pressure.
It can. The source also notes that being flexible, using suppression sometimes when appropriate, but also expressing feelings at other times is linked to better mental health. But relying too heavily on suppression, especially internal suppression, is often linked with less effective coping in the long run.
So it's not that suppression is always bad, but how and how often you use it really matters.
Definitely. And this brings us back to why this daily diary study is so valuable. A lot of older research used labs, telling people which strategy to use,
Right. Now try to reappraise.
which is useful, but it doesn't tell us much about what people spontaneously do when life throws them a curveball. This study, with its ecological validity, gets closer to that real-world picture, where people might use several strategies at once or fall back on habits without conscious thought.
Okay, so it's moving from what can people do when told to what do people do when stressed?
Pretty much, understanding those spontaneous choices is key. So how exactly did they set up this daily diary to capture all that?
Yeah, let's get into the method. How did they actually collect this data day by day?
Okay, so the core was this online daily diary. Participants filled it out for 7 days in a row.
A whole week tracking their emotional ups and downs.
Well, specifically the downs. Each day, they had to think back over the past 24 hours and identify the single situation that caused their strongest negative emotions.
Ah, okay, not just any bad mood, but the peak negative event of the day. That's important.
Crucial. It ensures they're capturing regulation attempts when feelings were genuinely intense.
Makes sense. What did they report about that event?
First, they described the situation in their own words. Then, they identified the specific emotions they felt. They could list anything: anger, sadness, frustration, guilt, whatever. They could name them freely or use prompts if needed.
So it wasn't just ticking a box for felt bad. They could list multiple specific feelings.
Yes, and people often did, like anger, disappointment, and worry, or sadness and helplessness. It captured that complex mix you often feel in tough situations.
That adds real richness.
Huh.
Then what?
Then, for each emotion they listed for that situation, they rated its intensity on a scale from 1, not intense at all, to 10, extremely intense.
So they put a number on the strengths of each feeling involved in that peak event.
Exactly. And for the analysis, the researchers calculated an emotion intensity score for that day's event by averaging the intensity ratings of all the emotions listed.
Okay, so if you felt anger at an 8 and frustration at a 6, the intensity score for that event would be 7. A single number for the overall punch of that situation.
Right. It gives a way to quantify how impactful that strongest negative event felt.
And how did they figure out which regulation strategies were used? Did people just write about it?
No, it was more structured. They were shown a list of 15 sentences. 3 sentences describe typical behaviors for each of the 5 strategies we talked about: reappraisal, rumination, distraction, acceptance, suppression.
Okay.
They read the list and had to mark all the sentences that applied to how they dealt with their emotions in that specific situation they just described.
Ah, so they could tick multiple boxes,
Yeah.
reflecting that people often try more than one thing.
Precisely. That's key for capturing the real-world complexity. People might try to distract themselves and suppress their expression, for example.
So how did they measure strategy use from those ticked boxes?
For most strategies, it was pretty simple. If a participant marked at least one sentence related to, say, acceptance, then acceptance was coded as used
Yeah.
for that day's event. If they marked none for acceptance, it was not used, a 0.
Binary used it or didn't?
Mostly. The only exception was distraction. Because it was used less often overall, they measured it continuously by just counting how many of the 3 distraction sentences were marked.
Okay.
And importantly, they also calculated the total number of different strategies used for each event. Just a simple count of how many of the 5 categories had at least one sentence marked.
So they could see if someone used, say, just rumination, or if they tried rumination, suppression, and distraction.
Exactly. It captures the breadth of the regulation attempt.
Makes sense. Who were the participants in this study?
They started with 180 adults, recruited through snowball sampling participants, helping find more participants.
Okay.
For the main analysis, they focused on 88 people who completed the diary for at least 5 out of the 7 days. They wanted enough data per person to see patterns.
That seems reasonable. Gives you almost a full week's worth for most people.
Right. And this gave them a total of 538 daily observations across everyone. The average age was around 36, ranging from 18 to 71. About 27%, so just over a quarter, were men.
Were there any restrictions on who could participate?
Yes, a couple of important ones. Participants couldn't have a diagnosed mental disorder, and they couldn't have experienced any major life stressors like losing a loved one or a job in the month before or during the study.
Okay, so they were aiming for a generally non-clinical population dealing with, let's say, significant but normal daily stressors, not acute trauma or ongoing mental illness.
That seems to be the focus, yes. Capturing regulation of intense everyday negative emotions in relatively stable adults.
And how did they analyze all this data, daily reports nested within individuals?
They used multi-level linear regression models. It's a statistical technique designed for this kind of data, where you have repeated measurements from the same people over time. It accounts for the fact that your own reports day to day are likely more similar to each other than to someone else's.
Controls for individual differences.
Exactly. And they also included age and gender in the models to see if those factors predicted strategy use, controlling for their effects.
Okay, solid methodology. So let's get to the results. What did they find? Were people actually reporting intense emotions?
They definitely were. The average intensity scores for the strongest negative event each day were consistently high, ranging from about 6.2 to 7.2 on that 10-point scale across the week.
So yeah, these were genuinely strong feelings people were grappling with, not minor annoyances.
Right, the method successfully captured moments of significant emotional impact.
And which strategies did people report using most often overall?
Okay, so looking across all 538 diary entries, the most frequently reported strategy was acceptance. It showed up in 44% of the reports.
Wow, acceptance was number one. Almost half the time people felt intensely negative, they reported trying to just accept the feeling. That's higher than I might have guessed.
It was the most common. Close behind were suppression at 41%, then rumination at 39%, followed by reappraisal at 36%. The least frequent was distraction, reported in 28% of entries.
So it's a real mix. Acceptance is common, but so are suppression and rumination, which are often seen as less helpful, especially rumination. Reappraisal, often considered adaptive, is used a fair bit, but not the most. Distraction is least common.
It really paints a picture of the mixed bag of strategies people actually use in daily life when things get tough. It's not all adaptive coping, that's for sure.
Okay, so now the big question. How did the intensity of the emotion relate to which strategies people chose? What was the first key finding here?
The first key finding confirmed one of their main hypotheses. It was about intensity and rumination.
Okay.
They found that higher emotion intensity was a significant positive predictor for choosing the rumination strategy.
Let's pause on that. Positive predictor means the more intense the negative feeling was, the higher that average score, the more likely the person was to report using rumination.
Exactly that. The stronger the feeling, the greater the odds they got stuck in those negative thought loops.
Why would that be? Why does feeling worse make you more likely to ruminate?
Well, the study ties this back to physiological arousal. Intense emotions come with high arousal. Your heart pounds, you feel agitated, and this high arousal state is seen as a risk factor for rumination.
Okay.
It's linked to stress, emotional reactivity. And the idea, supported by some brain imaging studies mentioned in the source, is that when you're highly aroused, your brain's bottom-up systems, the more automatic, emotion-driven parts like the amygdala, become highly active.
The alarm bells are ringing.
Right.
Huh.
And at the same time, the top-down control systems, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for deliberate thought, planning, impulse control, seem to get less active or effective. High arousal kind of disrupts that higher-level thinking.
So the emotional brain takes over and the thinking brain struggles to keep up.
That's a good way to put it. And rumination, being this sort of automatic, repetitive, negative thought pattern, might be the easier or more default pathway when those top-down controls are weakened by high arousal. It takes less deliberate effort than, say, actively trying to solve the problem or reframe it.
Wow. Okay, that's a huge insight for listeners. It's not just that you happen to ruminate when you feel bad. The intensity itself might actually hijack your brain's ability to do more constructive thinking, making rumination the path of least resistance. It explains why it feels almost impossible not to ruminate when you're really upset.
It's a powerful biological and cognitive explanation. And the second key finding looks at the flip side, intensity and reappraisal.
Which they predicted would be a negative relationship, right? Higher intensity, less reappraisal.
Correct. And finding number 2 confirmed exactly that. Higher emotion intensity was a significant negative predictor for choosing reappraisal. The more intense the feelings, the less likely people were to report trying to think differently about the situation.
So putting findings 1 and 2 together, high intensity makes you more likely to ruminate, often unhelpful, and less likely to reappraise, often helpful. That really highlights the core challenge of regulating intense emotions in the real world.
It's the central paradox, isn't it? The very moments you most need a strategy like reappraisal, your high emotional state makes it harder to access and use it effectively.
Why again? Same reason as with rumination.
Essentially, yes. Reappraisal is a demanding cognitive strategy. It relies heavily on those prefrontal top-down control processes to deliberately shift perspective and find new meanings. But high arousal, as we said, seems to impair or thwart that capacity for effortful cognitive work. When under stress or high arousal, people tend to conserve mental energy, making effortful strategies like reappraisal less likely.
So the big takeaway so far is massive. When your emotions are peaking, your brain defaults towards the less helpful automatic path of rumination and simultaneously finds it much harder to engage the helpful, effortful path of reappraisal. That's a fundamental battle.
It truly is. It explains why advice like, just look on the bright side, often falls flat when someone is deeply distressed. The intensity itself is working against that advice.
Okay, so intensity strongly predicted more rumination and less reappraisal. What about the other three strategies? Acceptance, distraction, and suppression. Finding number three.
Finding number 3 was interesting. Intensity was not a statistically significant predictor for choosing acceptance, distraction, or suppression in this study.
Not significant. So how intense the feeling was didn't reliably predict whether people used these three.
That's what the data showed. The source did mention a trend where higher intensity was linked to slightly less suppression, but it didn't reach statistical significance.
Why might that be? Why would intensity matter so much for rumination and reappraisal, but not these others?
The researchers suggest that for these strategies, especially in complex daily situations, other factors might be more important drivers than just the intensity level. Maybe the specific type of situation matters more for choosing acceptance. Maybe your personal goals in that moment influence whether you try to distract yourself. Acceptance, remember, was the most common strategy overall, seemingly used frequently regardless of intensity in this sample.
So it suggests that while intensity acts like a major switch between rumination and reappraisal, the choice to use acceptance, distraction, or suppression might depend more on the specific context, the particular flavor of the emotion, or individual habits and motivations, rather than just how strong the feeling is.
That seems to be the interpretation. It reinforces that real-world emotion regulation is definitely complex with multiple factors at play. Intensity is one big factor, but not the only one, especially for these other strategies.
Okay. Now, the study also looked at other influences, like gender. What did they find there? Finding number four was about gender and acceptance.
Yes. Finding number 4 showed that gender was a significant positive predictor for using the acceptance strategy.
Positive predictor. Hang on, how was gender coded?
Men were coded as 1 in the model.
Okay, so a positive predictor means men were more likely to report using acceptance than women in response to their strongest negative event of the day.
That's what the study's data indicated, yes. Men reported choosing acceptance more frequently than women in these high-intensity situations.
Huh. That's interesting and maybe counter to some common stereotypes. How did the researchers interpret that finding?
They discussed it in light of other research. They mentioned studies suggesting women sometimes report less acceptance of negative feelings and are also generally more prone to depression, with rumination being a key factor in depression. So, they speculate, and it is speculation, that perhaps acceptance might function somewhat as an opposite to rumination in these intense moments. If rumination involves getting stuck in negative evaluation, acceptance is about non-judgmental awareness. So, finding men using acceptance more might somehow relate to broader patterns where women might, on average, be more susceptible to rumination or self-criticism around negative emotions, but they stress this needs more research.
That's a really interesting potential link. Acceptance as a possible counterweight to rumination, and finding gender differences there adds complexity.
It does. And the fifth key finding also involved gender, but this time looking at the number of different strategies used.
Right, you said intensity didn't predict the number of strategies
Y-
to gender.
Yes, it did. Finding number 5. Gender was a significant predictor for the total number of different strategies people reported using for their peak negative event.
Okay, and who used more?
According to the source, men reported using statistically more different types of strategies, about zero point 0.6 more strategies on average per situation than women did for their most intense negative event of the day.
Now, that seems to contradict some other research I thought you mentioned earlier. Didn't some studies find women use a wider variety overall?
You're right to pick up on that, and the authors address this directly. They acknowledge that some previous research, often using questionnaires about general tendencies, has reported women using a broader range of strategies across all kinds of situations. They also mention other findings suggesting women might, on average, experience negative emotions more often or more intensely, and perhaps see a wider array of situations as stressful.
So maybe women have a bigger general toolkit they draw from more often because they encounter more situations they perceive as needing regulation.
That's part of the thinking, but the authors offer a specific interpretation for their finding in this study. Remember, participants here reported on the single strongest negative event of that day.
Right, the peak event.
So, the authors speculate that perhaps men might be more selective about which situations they deem truly significant or severe enough to warrant a major regulation effort. But for those specific situations that they do perceive as highly stressful and important, their peak negative event, they might then deploy more resources, trying a larger number of different strategies to manage it, precisely because they've identified this particular event as requiring significant emotional work.
Ah, I see. So it's not about the size of the overall toolbox, but about how many tools you bring out for the day's biggest challenge. Maybe men have a higher threshold for what counts as a big challenge, but when they hit it, they throw more strategies at it.
That's the nuanced interpretation they propose.
Yeah.
It shifts the focus from general repertoire to the specific response elicited by the most intense emotional event encountered daily in this study's design. It's a plausible way to reconcile their findings with some earlier work.
Fascinating. Okay, let's try to wrap our heads around the big picture from this study. What are the main takeaways?
Well, the absolute core message is that the intensity of your emotion is a really powerful factor shaping how you try to regulate it, especially in the moment. High intensity seems to almost automatically push you towards rumination and pull you away from reappraisal. That's huge.
Right, that intensity effect is key.
And then, layered on that, factors like gender also seem to play a role, influencing things like the use of acceptance and just how many different strategies people throw at their most challenging emotional moments each day.
It paints a picture of this dynamic interplay between how bad you feel, your automatic tendencies, and maybe some demographic factors influencing your choices in real time.
Exactly. And it's interesting, as we noted, that intensity didn't predict the number of strategies used overall. The authors suggest this might be because the strongest event each day could vary a lot in nature. Maybe one day it's intense anger, the next intense sadness. The number of strategies might be more tailored to the specific type of challenge rather than just its raw intensity score.
That makes sense. The strategy count might depend more on what kind of problem is this, rather than just how bad does it feel.
Precisely. It suggests the amount of regulation effort might be driven by a more complex mix of situational details, the specific emotion blend, maybe personality, things not fully captured just by the intensity rating.
This study definitely gives us that valuable real-world perspective. What would you say are its biggest strengths?
The main one is definitely that ecological validity we keep mentioning. Studying emotion regulation as it actually unfolds in people's complex, messy, personally meaningful daily lives, not just in a controlled lab. That gives us insights into spontaneous coping.
Getting data from life as it's lived.
Right. And also allowing participants to name their own emotions freely, capturing that rich mix of feelings people genuinely experience rather than forcing them into preset boxes. That adds authenticity.
Definitely strengths. But what about limitations? No study is perfect.
True. The source is upfront about limitations. Daily diaries rely on self-report, which means memory can be imperfect, even over 24 hours, and people's interpretations are subjective.
Right, it's not an objective brain scan, it's what people remember and choose to report.
Exactly. Also, by focusing on ecological validity, they lose experimental control. They don't know the exact nature of every strongest event, so they can't easily compare regulation across specific types of situations.
Classic trade-off. Real-world relevance versus controlled variable.
That's the one. And finally, they note that their statistical models, while finding significant effects for intensity and gender, didn't explain a massive amount of the overall variation in strategy use. Meaning that while intensity and gender are clearly important pieces of the puzzle, there are definitely many other factors influencing why someone chooses a specific strategy in a specific moment. Things like the exact type of emotion, other situational details, personality traits, learned habits, these all likely play a big role too, and weren't fully accounted for here.
So intensity and gender matter, but the full picture of moment-to-moment regulation is even more complex.
Absolutely. But despite limitations, the findings are still really significant.
Why? What are the key implications, especially practically?
Well, first, they provide strong real-world support for theories about how emotional arousal affects our thinking. The idea that high arousal hinders effortful cognitive strategies like reappraisal and makes less effortful ones like rumination more likely. This study shows that playing out in daily life.
It grounds that theory in lived experience.
Yes. It also highlights why we need both lab studies for control and ecological studies for relevance. They complement each other. But crucially, the source points out these findings have direct implications for psychological help, like therapy.
How so? How could a therapist use this?
Well, think about it. If you're working with someone who gets overwhelmed by intense anger or anxiety and just gets stuck ruminating, understanding why is key. This study suggests it's not just that they aren't trying hard enough to think differently.
Right. It suggests the intensity itself is actively working against reappraisal and promoting rumination.
Exactly. So a therapist can use this knowledge. It means simply teaching reappraisal skills might not be enough. You need to help the client. 1. Recognize the pattern. When I hit an 8 out of 10 anger, my brain defaults to rumination. 2. Understand why it's harder to think clearly when I'm that aroused. And 3. Develop strategies specifically to manage that high-intensity state.
Like what kind of strategies?
Maybe practicing acceptance first, just to ride the wave down a bit before trying to reappraise. Or maybe pre-planning reappraisals for known triggers before the intensity gets too high. Or even just building awareness to interrupt the rumination cycle earlier. It's about targeting the intervention to that specific high arousal challenge.
That makes so much sense. It's not just teaching the skill, but teaching how to deploy it, or related skills, precisely when the intensity makes it hardest. Building resilience for the peaks.
Precisely. Tailoring help to the reality of how regulation often breaks down under pressure.
So let's try to crystallize the main message from our deep dive today. It really seems to be that understanding how the sheer intensity of your emotion acts as this powerful, almost automatic switch pushing you towards rumination, pulling you away from reappraisal, is just fundamental for navigating your inner life.
It really is. And the study adds those interesting layers about how other factors, like gender in this case, might influence things like using acceptance or how many strategies you try when facing those peak emotional moments.
It really makes you appreciate the complex dance going on inside, doesn't it? Between how strong the feeling is and which tools your brain automatically reaches for, versus the ones that might actually help more but require effort that feels impossible in the moment.
It does. It invites you to reflect on your own patterns. When you're really overwhelmed, do you notice that pull towards rumination?
Yeah.
Does reappraisal feel out of reach?
Yeah, and if this research shows that rumination is more likely when intensity is high, but it's often unhelpful, while reappraisal is helpful but harder when intensity is high, well, that leaves us with a really crucial question, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It poses a challenge for all of us.
What might this mean for how you, listening right now, need to approach developing skills for your absolute toughest emotional moments? If the default isn't helpful and the helpful feels impossible, what's the path forward?
That's the provocative thought to leave you with. Given this dynamic, how can you consciously work against that automatic, intensity-driven pull towards rumination when you feel completely overwhelmed?
Yeah.
How might you proactively build the capacity, maybe through acceptance, maybe through other means, to engage more adaptive strategies even when the emotional storm is raging? Thinking about that could be key to truly mastering your emotional world.